Hello. Today I'm starting a new book. If you were me and lived in Colonial America, it's written by Carole Roman. And let's see what life was like back in the real old days. If you were me and lived in colonial America, you would have been born in London, England, almost 400 years ago in about 1620. This is what the city of London looks like today. This is the England you would have left to come to the New World. What do you see as the biggest challenge? If you were a boy, your parents might have called you Comfort or Abraham. They may have chosen Patience or Mercy for your sisters' names. What do the names tell you about the society? Your parents may have chosen to follow the new Protestant religion. In the early 1500s, England was a Catholic country. Henry VIII was king, and he had one daughter with his wife, Queen Catherine. He wanted to assure the succession with a male child, but his wife was getting too old to have more children. He fell in love with Anne Boleyn and tried to divorce his wife. The Catholic Church in Rome refused to let the divorce happen, so Henry broke away from the church, creating a new national church called the Church of England. He declared himself the head of his new church and changed some of the ways people worshiped. His daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, continued with the new faith. Many people had already embraced this new religion and were called reformers or Protestants. They wanted a simpler church and thought that Henry and Elizabeth didn't change it enough. They thought the church should be plainer and the prayer books needed to be in their own language. They demanded that some of the rituals be eliminated. These people were called Puritans. They called for the formation of a new church and were known as separatists. What do you think the name separatists tells you about them? In England in the 1600s, it was illegal to be part of any other church than the rulers. Queen Elizabeth had died and her cousin James Stuart became king. While he was a Protestant, many felt he wasn't strict enough and they complained. The church reformers presented him with a list of things they wanted to be abolished. King James I wanted to keep things the way they were with Elizabeth, the old queen. He thought he was being tolerant of everybody. The Protestants were offended when he refused to embrace their ideas and felt persecuted. Many fled to the Dutch Netherlands where they could practice the way they desired. Your parents might have lived for a year or two in the Dutch Netherlands, but despite finally being able to practice their religion, they had to learn a new language. It was hard for them to find work, and they did not want you to join the Dutch army. In 1620, they heard of a couple of ships that were sailing to a new place to settle in a land without persecution. They were traveling to a land where colonies of people like them were able to settle in homes and worship the way they wanted. These ships were called the Mayflower and the Speedwell. The ship set sail in September 1620 and made land in the deep winter after a 66-day journey. They were originally supposed to land near the Hudson River in New York, but dangerous shoals and bad weather forced both ships in the northerly direction to New England. They named the place where they arrived Plymouth. Now, this is different than what I heard. I heard the Speedwell had a hole and had to turn around and go back to England before it even left. So this is a little different than what we learned. The people decided to form a new government to keep order. They needed a contract for all the settlers to follow to keep peace and ensure they would survive in the harsh new land. They wrote up a set of laws for them all to live by. All the men were called upon to agree with the rules. Your father signed the Mayflower Compact, which set up the colony's government. Your father and uncle scouted to find a good place to set up camp. After a few weeks of searching, they found an abandoned Native American village. There was a good harbor, ample water supply, and fields to be used for planting, all on a hill that made defending the community easier. December was cold that year. You had a nasty head cold, and while you were not feeling well, others were much worse. A graveyard was created for many who could not survive the bitter weather and lack of permanent housing. Imagine arriving after a long journey to a land gripped in winter. The landscape was as forbidding as the moon with its snow covered frozen earth, and not a dwelling in sight. There were no streetlights, stores, or church, as well as no conveniences or friends, only raw land and the limited supplies brought from Europe. Everything had to be made from scratch. Your father brought tools, nails, and iron hardware. Every day he and your uncle went into the woods and used axes to chop down trees. First, they built a frame like a skeleton of the house. Then, they bundled reeds from the marshes to make thatched roofs similar to those in England. Outside, they created clapboards or shingles to cover the exterior walls of the home. Inside, they took dirt, clay, and grass to make a sort of plaster they called daub. They reinforced it with interlaced rods and sticks called wattle to make the interior walls of the house. It could take 2 months to finish a home. You had to live exposed to the cold winter winds for most of that first winter. The home your father and uncle constructed was not large compared to the cottage you left behind in Europe. It seemed primitive. It had one room with a dirt floor. Everything from cooking to working or sleeping was done in this communal room. You had little or no privacy, which sometimes led to fierce fights with your little sister. Your mother cooked in a fireplace that, once lit, always contained a fire. It took up most of the wall. It had a chimney that removed some of the smoke out of the room. Inside, the house was dimly lit, and the smells of all the people, food, and candles made it stuffy. It was drafty when the wind blew through spaces in the wall. You constantly had to plug the holes with mud. There was one small window with a shutter that barely covered the opening. Your uncle slept in the loft, which was a storage space built onto the wall above the ground floor. He had a ladder to climb up, and you envied the space. At least he had a piece of the cabin for himself. Mama kept the dried food and herbs up there, so it smelled better than the rest of the cabin. She grew those herbs and some vegetables in a small garden outside the door that she and your sister tended. And we will read part 2 on Monday. Thanks for listening.